Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in for today's free webinar, Embracing Change for Business Success. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm a business journalist at Smith School of Business, and I'm in Kingston, Ontario on this gray day in October. Before I introduce today's speakers, I want to remind you, as I always do, that this webinar is being presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. I also want to remind you that this discussion will be recorded. Everyone who has signed up to participate and attend will be receiving a copy of the recording in their email. I would invite you to share that with your colleagues or anyone you think might be interested in it. You'll be getting that by email in a couple of days. And finally, I would encourage you to ask questions. Please ask questions. We've got a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we will get to those questions at the last part of the presentation, so the last 15 minutes or so. So don't wait until the last minute to ask your question. We will get to them in orders. We try to get to them in the order in which they arrive. So get them in early and often, and we'll get to questions at the last 15 minutes. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's guest speakers. Our first is Dr. Elspeth Murray, who has served as the Associate Dean of the MBA and Master's programs at Smith School of Business since 2012. She has been a professor of strategy and entrepreneurship at Smith School of Business since 1996. She also holds the CIBC Fellowship in Entrepreneurship and founded Smith's Center for Business Venturing. Prior to joining Smith, she worked in industry for several firms, including IBM and Canadian Tire. As an integral part of her work in the strategy in new venture fields, Elspeth specializes in the management of change. In 2012, she co-authored the best-selling book, Fast Forward, Organizational Change in 100 Days with Peter Richardson, who is not, I don't think, related to Alan Richardson, our second guest today. Alan Richardson is the Vice President of RBC Learning and Performance, a group which designs and delivers innovative learning and performance, innovative learning, performance enablement, and internal mobility solutions for employees globally across RBC. He orchestrates award-winning development programs such as RBC's Career Launch program. While at RBC, Alan has held a variety of roles such as VP, HR Transformation, HR Business Partner, and has led the Organizational Effectiveness Team. Prior to joining RBC, Alan was a management consultant with the Boston Consulting Group, where he provided strategic advice to clients across an array of industries. Welcome, Elspeth and Alan. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm now going to step away from the screen, and I will be back with audience questions at around, well, whenever you guys are done, leaving enough time at the end for questions. So talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you very much, Meredith, and good afternoon. Or good evening, I think, for some of you. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us today. This is a great opportunity for a bit of a tag team today. And Alan and I are going to cover what I would describe as both the theory and practice associated with embracing change. And full disclosure, and I should have let Meredith know this, Alan and I are actually related. So part of one big happy family. And I'd like to think we have some pull to get someone as accomplished as Alan as part of this webinar series. So Alan, I think you may have brought that up too. So we'll just get that out of the way right from the get-go. Kind of and welcome. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. We can take the dinner table chit chat and actually share some of what we discussed with the folks on the webinar here today. Okay, as usual, I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to take about 20 minutes talking about a bit of the theory and a little bit of practice related to really embracing change as opposed to just managing it or leading it. And I think that's one of the takeaways from the session here today as well. I'm going to turn things over to Alan, and he's going to talk about what RBC is doing in this whole area. So very interesting to really look at, again, how the theory meets practice. So let us start. And by the way, I think the prize goes to Renee from Mexico City, one of our EMBA grads, all the way back from 2000. So Renee, it's great to have you here, and I'm sure we have some other alums as well. So many of you will know, but some of you who are sort of new to Smith and the webinars may not know. I've been sort of studying and thinking about the change game for at least 15 years. And with my co-author, Peter Richardson, we sort of developed an approach to thinking about change that moves away from what we would call episodic change. Every now and again, you know, we have to do change and we get through it and we hope we never have to do it again. You know, we really sort of studied the change game from a different perspective. And that was one of, how do you create, as part of the organizational DNA, the ability to not treat change as sort of an episode every now and again, but to really embed the know-how and the routines into the organization that make change easier. So that's going to be the focus of our talk today. We refer to this, you know, organizational DNA, if you will, the winning conditions. And the winning conditions really have three elements. You have to point the ship in the right direction. You have to get a head of steam up, a little bit of speed in the whole process, and then you have to get a critical mass of resources. And collectively, these tend to give you the momentum to just get the job done and get the job done often. And that will be a theme that we're going to cover today as well. So if we think about the winning conditions, you know, at a conceptual level, it's not really that helpful. And we are, as a family, huge fans of Formula One racing, and in particular, Lewis Hamilton and the team at Mercedes. And for those of you who may not know a lot about F1, obviously high performance cars, and Lewis Hamilton has just equaled Michael Schumacher's record in terms of wins. But the reason I wanted to talk about F1 is when you look at the success of any racing team, for sure you have to have a world-class driver. That's Lewis Hamilton in the middle. But that doesn't get you very far unless you have a whole team around you who understands, you know, what the conditions are to actually win the race. So if you look at these conditions in the context of F1, or you can think about NASCAR or any kind of a race, you need that capable driver. You have to have a good car. The pit stops are absolutely crucial. So the shorter, the better. You need to study the track. You need to understand what's happening when you're in motion. So constant communication, there's a lot of that. Things crop up as you're racing around the track that you may have been able to anticipate, but often couldn't anticipate. So you have to be able to make decisions rapidly, so on and so forth. What's interesting is that every week or every 2 weeks, there's a new race, and the same winning conditions help you win the race. So the entire team doesn't view the race as every now and again. It's just business, and that's what they do. So routine becomes very important, and routine for everyone. And just as an aside, and I actually, thank you Google, had to double check this, the world record for the fastest pit stop is actually not Team Mercedes, it's the Red Bull team. And think about this as we start talking about change and speed and routine. The fastest pit stop, 4 tires change, was 1.82 seconds. I thought it was a mistake actually, so I had to go and check it out. So think about the collective winning conditions to actually win the race, not just once, but time and time again. And how this concept of making change routinized, or somewhat routinized, is perhaps a real key to success. So over the 15 odd years that we've been studying and working in the change game, we have sure run up against a few myths. Change is still considered an episode in many organizations. People sort of have a throwaway line that says, oh, change is a constant, but they don't really get it. Change happens every now and again, and we treat change like a big project that takes a huge amount of effort, and then we hope to go back to some sort of steady state, which is perhaps a goal that should not be sought after, especially given today's environment. Another myth that we run up against all the time is, you know, culture change, just like everything takes a long time. It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think it's going to take 5 years, guess what? It's going to take 5 years. We're going to talk about COVID in just a moment with respect to how some of these myths have been busted. So we run up against number 4, which is people don't like change, which is categorically false. There are lots of people who thrive on change and people who could thrive on change, but they don't yet have a routine or it's not yet automatic. And we'll come back to that. I would suggest that one of the killers of change and forward momentum is this quest for perfection. These days, many organizations that are successful in the change game are sort of adopting a test and learn approach, which means you don't have one big, huge reveal, but you think much more incrementally in sort of the power of many small wins. And one thing I'm going to come back to a little bit later is a wonderful concept called the growth mindset. So thank you, Carol Dweck, on that front. So there has been a lot of myth busting lately, and there are 3 interconnected themes today in this webinar. We're going to start talking about what have we learned from COVID that's helpful in the change game. We're going to talk about this great concept called muscle memory, which is a big part of building routine and individual and organizational DNA around being able to do change. And then, of course, we'll draw this together and we'll talk about how these 2 things relate to the change game. So what have we learned from COVID? This is a research project that I've just embarked on. And there are many lessons learned. First and foremost is that big change can be done. Back to the myth busting. It can be done quickly and it can be done successfully enough. In the transition that we've all gone through in our working lives and even our personal lives with respect to COVID, we didn't get it all right, but we got most of it right. And that then allowed us to kind of fix the rest of the things along the way. Most notably things like working from home and figuring out the work-life balance. So I'm not going to share all of what I've learned so far in this research, but I thought you might be interested in comparing your notes with the notes that I've gathered from a number of different organizations that are participating in the study so far. I'm not going to read each and every one of these. You guys can read that as I'm chatting away. Many of these things may resonate with you. But I would offer up a couple of sort of summary comments. You know, the transition we all went through, again, work and family lives with respect to what COVID made us do, is kind of, it proved a bunch of things that were possible. It proved that people, you know, really can embrace change. It proved that things can get done quickly if there's the wherewithal to do that. In some of the research that I've been doing so far, 2 things not on this slide that have come up time and time again. Number 1 is that people are actually very worried about slipping back into the old routines. So not losing the connectedness, not losing the focus on a few clear goals, not losing the ability to be empowered and make decisions, you know, to critically think, to actually get stuff done, the power of those small moves. Even the adrenaline or dopamine rush that many people comment on associated with doing something pretty extraordinary. So people are worried about slipping back, which means it's a golden opportunity to actually capitalize on some of these learnings to date. And I guess my final comment is that perhaps perversely, people have quite enjoyed the experience, maybe back to the dopamine and adrenaline rush. And by the way, a terrific book to read when we talk about routines and embedding new practices is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Highly recommended read, and some comments very much aligned with what we'll talk about today. So when we talk about these routines and not slipping back, I wanted to talk about some fascinating research and what the science says about embedding new ways of doing things. And we refer to kind of this bucket of science as something called muscle memory. And this is really the long-lasting memory for skills or routines or procedures. And the very interesting part of this, for me anyways, in the change game, is that whether you're riding a bike or learning a new skill or speaking a new language, the concept of muscle memory is that these things become automatic and without thought. And because that's the case, the energy required to actually execute these things becomes far less. And I don't want anyone to think that we're talking about a fitness regime here, because the concept of muscle memory applies to organizational routines and kind of a package of skills as well. And not surprisingly, because we're humans, this is all about the brain. So let's talk a little bit more about what the science says. And I promise you, we're not going to go into a deep dive about various aspects of memory. But the most important thing to remember here is that muscle memory, the memory for skills, is also referred to as procedural memory. And you will see the link on this slide if you're interested in the really terrific article that talks about research done at Oxford University. So when we look at this thing called muscle memory, here's the classic definition. And again, creating muscle memory decreases the need for attention and creates maximum efficiency. And this is the one point that is so critical then when we talk about change. So let's go back to COVID for just a moment. So people commented that they enjoyed the activity, they don't want to slip back, but everyone acknowledged how hard it was. And the question then comes up, well, how is this sustainable? Back to episodic change versus something that's more embedded. So the key here is that if there's an opportunity to build this muscle memory, then the task of change becomes much easier and goes from the hard every now and again category into the, yeah, we know how to do this. Back to the F1 teams who practice, relentlessly on how to change tires, refuel quickly, and things like that. So a couple of studies I wanted to share with you, which I found quite interesting. And again, the science here is pretty straightforward. So there's an interesting study on juggling. So they took two groups, they trained them for 6 weeks. They looked at what was happening in the brain after this training around juggling. And a very interesting fact became clear, is that the connections in the brain, so-called white matter, improved dramatically. So for juggling, this helps with hand-eye coordination, but other studies have suggested it just helps, period, in terms of faster and easier sharing of information. Interesting. So a second study was done looking at violinists, and this is the last bit of science, I promise, and then we'll tie it back into the change game. So there were professional violinists and amateur violinists who were playing the same Mozart concerto. And again, the researchers were looking at what was happening in the brain while this was occurring. So both of them, for obvious reasons, activated the motor cortex, which is the hand-eye coordination piece. But here's the really interesting finding, is that the professionals, so those who practiced more, for which playing was much more routinized, the brain indicated that there was improved efficiency in performing these movements. And also interesting, there was less activation in other parts of the brain, parts of the brain, meaning more automatic performance of the task. So not as hard as for the amateurs. So let's now talk about what this all means or might mean for change. And I would suggest that in many organizations, we have too many amateurs and not enough pros, and not enough exposure and repetition or routine practicing to actually turn amateurs into pros. And so if we look at two examples of where this occurs already, but maybe not as much in other organizations, is both the military and the firefighters, who don't have time to go up a learning curve, who don't have time to activate their brains appropriately to get the job done. They must be able to actually execute in a repeated fashion and a successful fashion. So one of the things to consider then is organizationally, what does a pro actually look like? And more importantly, how do we create fewer amateurs and more pros? I use an instrument created by a colleague at Purdue that actually assesses what people who are good at change, what do they actually look like? And we'll send a copy of this survey to you afterwards. And there is a score, so you can tell how much of a pro or an amateur you might be. And we're not going to talk about all of these in detail today. I'm going to hone in on just one of these, this notion of confidence, to show you how one organization, not RBC, I'll let Alan talk about that, how one organization, by focusing on one thing and getting the job done, created an entirely different climate for change and has reaped the benefits in terms of stock price. So many of these are obvious. So resourcefulness means you're really good at actually digging around and figuring out how to get the job done. Adaptability means that, you know, if plan A doesn't work, then you're A-okay with plan B. You know, optimism is critical. That's the glass is half full versus the glass is half empty. You have to be optimistic in the change game. And I think one of the tragedies in many organizations is that in any sort of change, people always refer to the things that didn't work before or some of the stats historically on why it can't work. Confidence is really associated with the growth mindset. And again, I'll come back to that in just a moment. Adventurousness means that you really liked the thrill of jumping over the chasm. You know, change is a full contact sport. You know, you have to like to actually win the game. Tolerance for ambiguity, I think, is pretty clear, especially in today's environment. That's another lesson from COVID. Nobody knew what was going to happen. In the early days, we knew virtually nothing, but we made some assumptions. We started moving on that front and we sort of figured things out as we went along. And then passion and drive, you know, really loving the change game, and there are always a good core of people who like that. That's the fuel that brings alive everything else. So I'm a huge fan of focus. You can't change everything at once. You can't address all of these things, you know, with every individual in your organization, but you can sure pick off one or two to actually start to embed those routines and turn amateurs into pros. So many of you who have either been in our programs or have been to any of our other change courses will be familiar with something that we call the 20-70-10 principle. And we often refer to it as a key element of the change game, really talking about finding the pros, the 20%, enabling them to transfer knowledge, know-how, and even give the cues around change to the amateurs and basically help them along. So that's the 70%. And the 10% are often in the no way, no how category. And obviously there are decisions to make on that front. Couple of things to take away from this for those of you who haven't seen this before. The pros exist at every level in the organization, and you need them at every level in the organization, because peers are much more successful in convincing other peers of how to do things, how to show the way. They're more credible, the communication is faster. There are a whole bunch of other things here. So that's another thing to take away from this. So let's look at how you turn amateurs into pros and how you actually take something like the 20-70-10 principle and put it into practice. And here I'm going to talk about the one element of those who embrace change, and that is confidence. So thank you, Carol, once again for pointing out The challenges with a fixed mindset, so believing that you only know what you know, versus adopting a growth mindset, which is really associated with believing that people can learn anything. Back to the myth about people don't like change. So this has very successfully been put into practice by Satya Nadella at Microsoft. And you can see the impact of Nadella on Microsoft's share price. Pretty extraordinary. And I think many of us have written Microsoft off or had written Microsoft off as kind of a one-trick pony. Desktop operating system, not a whole lot after that, except a few games here and there. And now they're on fire in a positive way. So here's what Nadella did on that one piece called confidence, adopting the growth mindset. So when you're the CEO of a leader of any organization, you get the opportunity to actually mobilize resources around one or two things. So Nadella decided that the culture needed to be tuned up, and he needed to move individuals into this growth mindset, away from I know everything to I can learn everything, which may seem a daunting task because Microsoft was well known for a ruthless culture of firing the bottom 10%, so on and so forth. So it's going to be a challenge, or maybe not. So what Nadella did was he picked a mission for Microsoft to practice flexing the change muscle, if you will, and only one aspect of the change muscle. So he held a corporate hackathon, and he decided to focus on a terrible disease, ALS, and to pose a question: how might we use a Microsoft Surface to help ALS sufferers? And for those of you who are NFL football fans, you may know the story of Steve Gleason, who you see pictured on this slide, who had a very successful NFL career, was stricken with ALS, and really became a source of inspiration. And the long story short is that this very successful hackathon unleashed the growth mindset in Microsoft. And if you listen to Nadella speak, great book called Hit Refresh, and interviews as well, he really talks about how quickly the culture changed by focusing on one thing and building that change muscle, in this case, around confidence. So a few key takeaways to this point. I could go on and on about Steve Gleason and Microsoft, but I think I've taken a fair whack of time already, and I know you'll be really interested to hear about what RBC is doing. So a couple of things to think about. Are you still treating change as an episodic event? Or are you more focused, or should you be more focused on building this muscle memory and starting somewhere? I would suggest it's time to stop thinking about change taking a long time, because it doesn't have to. The third point is related to, at a minimum, finding your pros. Those are the 20 percenters. And point number 4 is that with those pros come all kinds of opportunities to move amateurs into that professional category. And I would certainly argue that that's the next wave of success in the change game, is to actually build this capacity inside the organization. And you have a couple of things to build off of. The COVID experience, the opportunity, as I articulated with Microsoft, to use things like corporate hackathons and great feel-good projects to show to people how it can be done. And there's probably an opportunity to think differently about who you're hiring and what you're actually looking for. So I'm going to pass the baton to Alan, and I think you'll be really interested in hearing what RBC is doing. A great example, and Alan and I have talked repeatedly about this thing called muscle memory. So I think you'll find a great success story. Not everything done yet, right, Alan? And
not yet.
Not yet, but in progress. And then we'll make sure we have time for questions at the end. So Alan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Elspeth, and hi, everyone. So pleased to be here. So I guess I'll start with the question. The question is, how long does it take to move an 85,000 person workforce at a rigid, structured financial institution to a virtual work environment? 3 decades, 3 years, or 3 weeks? And the question on that is, I think, really answered in the scope of this change discussion. So I'll talk a bit about RBC's history with change and sort of the path that led us towards sort of the COVID pandemic and how it hit us. But then I'll also talk about why that journey set us up so well to shift incredibly rapidly when COVID did hit and we recognized the need for change at that moment from that source. So on the path to COVID, about 5-6 years ago, Dave Mackay was newly minted as our CEO. He felt the need to provide an overarching guidance, and he really believed in this concept of a purpose-led organization. And we spent a lot of time as leadership, but also as a company, engaging with employees and senior leaders, creating something we call internally the collective ambition, which is really a purpose statement to help clients thrive and communities prosper, surrounded by our values, our vision, and a sense of how we will win as a team and as a company. And the great thing about having a purpose and making it clear and embedding it everywhere is it really helps you empower your organization to make decisions because they have a North Star. They always have a North Star to align to. And that collective ambition is not a long document. It's less than 60 words on a single page, but it helps everybody at any level understand and make judgment calls about what do I need to do in this situation or what do I need to do in reaction to this change. The second thing he did sort of a year or two later was start to really look at our leadership model. And we moved to a leadership model that is entirely behavioral based. There's no articulation of the outcomes we expect from leaders. There's no rules around what must be done as a leader. It is simply simple statements in plain language about how leaders should behave, what we expect of our leaders. And critically, from a change standpoint, one of those pillars, one of 4 pillars in this leadership model is adapting quickly and always learning. And there's about 5 or 6 statements of behaviors that we believe leaders need to have at any level in the organization in order for them to lead us through the ever-present change. And that cultural transformation was something that has been happening and continues to happen at RBC since that point at which we laid out the collective ambition and then the sort of leadership model that was going to help us guide our leadership on that journey. But it's not just about sort of the hearts and sort of framing for employees. It's also about what you do, to Elspeth's point, to build the pros, to build the process, to build the methods and ways we're going to respond to change. It was actually one of my first experiences with RBC. I was still at BCG. I worked with my current CHRO, Helena, and her team to build out a change management sort of operating model. And that was all about saying, we believe change is present all the time. We believe we need an embedded set of professionals who know how to help us through change, who know how to guide teams and organizations through change. And we actually determined a federated model where you had a strong central team, but change managers, professional change managers embedded in every platform was going to be the right approach to really make sure that it wasn't just this small cadre of professionals that had the skill, but they were training and helping the amateurs, and especially our people managers and our project managers, become really good at the basics of change. The other preparation we did, which is a bit more specific, any bank that survived the Great Recession in 2008 started to think much more about black swan events. And so we practice and we have contingency plans about what happens when a black swan event occurs. And many large companies do this now, which I think is a really important practice. And you don't obviously have black swan events all the time, but you run tabletop simulations. So just like those folks who in the Army or in firefighters are practicing as much as they can, we're making sure that the leaders who are in charge of that crisis response are pros at how to respond. And so in doing so, you've done a few things, and I'll relate it back to the guidance plus speed times critical mass equals momentum. You've given guidance through the leadership model, through your collective ambition. You've built the speed by embedding the practice of change throughout your organization. And you have critical mass of these pros, both from your crisis response teams and from your change managers that are embedded across. So COVID happens. It's March 12th, thereabout. Within 24 hours, our crisis management team globally has been turned on. People literally walk away from their day job and 100% are now focused on dealing with the crisis. Point two, we start to message really, really, really loudly what we need employees to do. And they're very simple messages. And the first thing was, again, we weren't a virtual bank. Sure, we were on a path to digitize, but most people worked in the office, in the branch, in the call center. You know, there were very few people as a percentage of our population who actually worked from home, and many weren't even enabled to work from home. So we asked people to essentially down gear for a couple weeks. The technology team went incredibly strong into building out the bandwidth, providing laptops to people who didn't have them, and essentially building out an infrastructure. And in less than 3 weeks, we had taken about 96 or 97% of our population were enabled and able to work from home if they needed to. The second thing that happened is we empowered people to start making decisions related to what they need to change. And I'll give an example from my own learning shop. In the pipeline at any given time, I have about 2,000 trainees who are coming into the bank, whether they're going into a branch, into a call center, into one of our rotational programs. We had to empower our teams of facilitators, of designers, to take a lot of content that was still delivered in person and make it virtual. And it was amazing because you're talking about 100 different courses for different slices of the population, and you're asking your teams to break into squads and essentially using sort of classic agile methods, quickly get to a good enough version of a virtual course so that we could start training people, because that pipeline for our front line is absolutely essential. And then the final thing, and I mentioned communication at the start, but we really started to think about how do we make sure that people have the information and the toolkit they need to be successful in this new environment. And we created a platform we call Live, Learn, and Lead Together. And really it's focused on the most relevant topics that our managers need, that our employees need, that our leaders need to be successful in this new paradigm. And so you start to train those amateurs to become pros. And that was things like personal wellness, mental health, resilience, but it was also for managers how to lead virtual teams. Because again, 2 weeks before we hadn't been virtual. And it was about thinking about where do we go from here? And how do we continue to meet the client where they are? And you know, many of our clients were going through the same, whether they're individuals or business clients or what have you, going through the same challenges. So how do we show up and help those clients through those challenging times? So making sure that we had, you know, a very clear voice, a very clear platform where people could access this or go to webinars and learn about these different topics that they needed, and having that out there and incredibly quick. And then we've been actually running sprints all through the summer and now into the fall, continuing to evolve that content and to think about it. Right now, as an example, we're worried that the second pandemic, frankly, will be one of mental health and wellness, because everyone's been under stress. Everyone's adrenaline has been running for 4, 5, 6 months. Now we're going to start to see cracks in that, and we're needing to think about what is next in terms of supporting our employees, be they parents, caregivers, you know, just struggling with how they show up at work, struggling with the isolation that comes from virtual work. How do we help them think and maintain their mental health and wellness? So so why do I think that happened so quickly? I think it is back to this point. We had an embedded sense of capability of professionals who knew what to do when the event happened. We had actually run the simulation before, truthfully, not quite as severe a pandemic, but because of SARS and the bird flu, we had done tabletop sessions before relating to a pandemic. We also had the capability broadly in our management team around change management and how to help and support people through change. And then we really focused on what are the essential things that need to get done in the first day, in the first 2 weeks, in the first 2 months to get ourselves through and out the other side. And doing that quickly has allowed us to now be very thoughtful about now how are we going to compete and how are we going to win and what's the opportunity as we go forward in this new virtual world. And I think the innovation that we're starting to come up with and the ideas that we're starting to see are truly exceptional and may not have happened if we hadn't been forced into this pressure cooker that COVID has been for the last number of months. I think that's about all I would start with. And I know we've got 19 minutes for questions, Elspeth. So maybe do you want to turn to questions and see what there is?
Sure, and I would encourage people to just kind of chuck them into the Q&A, and Meredith, do you want to help us coordinate this? But I'll actually start with one, Alan, and it is one of the first ones. So, crisis is always a great platform to sort of drive massive change, and what I found really interesting from the research on talking to people about, what have we learned from COVID. People referred to kind of we had a small set of shared goals. We were like really on a mission. There was a big problem to solve. But what I found interesting was that the number of people who just commented on how much they enjoyed it. So I think, the question is interesting because crisis almost always implies that it's really, really bad stuff that's happening. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the one thing that it's been interesting at RBC is it's not that we're manufacturing a crisis, but if you look at the industry, I mean, the banks have done, up till COVID hit, certainly the economy has now been in trouble, but banks have done quite well since the Great Recession, and profit margins are good and growth is good. In RBC, we still have this sort of feeling of existential threat, which is we know that there are tech companies out there, the FANGs of the world that are looking at our industry with eagerness and interest. And so one of the things that's really helped us keep momentum is that sense of we're always having to outdo ourselves, because if we don't, somebody else will. And for me, that's sort of reminiscent a bit of the infinite game that Simon Sinek talks about, which is, you're never going to win in business because it never ends. But what you can do is continue to you better yourself and innovate and change as an ongoing principle of how you work. And that actually helps you stay ahead of those disruptors who may come in and totally change and transform your industry. So I think that's been one thing. And I don't think we see it as a crisis, but we do see it as something that spurs action, innovation, and pace, because we recognize that the threat is real.
Okay. And again, I think it was just a great question, because again, one of the other myths is that it takes a crisis, which is usually super negative, to get stuff done. But back to kind of moving away from that thought onto something that's much more sustainable. Yeah, I'm sure open banking is top of mind for everyone. Okay, Meredith, I'll let you do your thing.
Thanks. The questions are coming in fast and furious now, which tends to happen. So let's see what we can do. This question is about speed. So change under crisis is much easier in many ways versus change when there's a lack of desire under complacency. How does one create speed under normal circumstances?
I think Alan sort of addressed that, is that, and I would just maybe answer that people, I think, now believe that things can happen faster. I don't think that belief was there before. And I think it's pretty extraordinary, Alan, when you talk about 85,000 people, like 3 weeks. I'm sure if you went out before that before COVID and said, this is what we're going to do, people would say like, it can't be done. It just can't be done.
Oh,
So
yeah, I mean, the plans were, yeah, the plans were for like 3-4 years until we could have enabled that level of virtual work. You know, the other thing I will say is I think that there are methods of working, and Agile does come to mind for me. I mean, it's been around forever, but there are methods of working that are known to increase speed among teams. And so if you're thinking at a micro level, at an individual or team enablement level, you know, I truly would recommend Agile as a way, or business sort of oriented Agile principles as a way to drive pace, because it's just about transparency and communication and priorities. And it really encourages people to address issues as soon as they come up, which is often, and what I find, it's the barriers, the blocks that end up slowing you down a lot of the time, and people don't address them and deal with them as quickly as they could.
Cool.
Wonderful, thanks. Next one, you guys both, one of you addressed the notion of a black swan equivalent. So Celine asks, were your black swan equivalents events equivalent to a business continuity plan when the company's site experiences technical issues or a building shutdown? What other scenarios were involved?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that was mine. The crisis management team that I spoke of that runs these tabletops has done a number. In my previous role as HR transformation, I was HR's rep to that. We did ones that were around reputational crisis issues. We did tabletops that were around technical issues and how we'd respond, for sure. Pandemics and other sort of societal changes were other ones that we've done. So the group that orchestrated those, and it was our BCP team, and they were the ones that would sort of seek out from the business, what are the sort of existential or black swan threats that you're worried about, the events that could happen, and we would just run simulations on, not all the time, but you know, a few a year that would take us through that, and they were quite educational, I have to say.
Okay, excellent. The next one, so you set yourself up for this, Alan, but I don't know if you can speak to these or not, but 2 questions around mental health, because you talked about that as a second pandemic, which I hadn't heard said before.
Yeah.
So the question is, mental health will become an obvious issue in coming days. How should large companies tackle that while maintaining confidentiality for employees? I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, that's a really, it's a great question. That is one of the challenges, and I'll sort of tackle that in the advice around preventing the next pandemic. Yeah. So this is, I think, the challenge, right? We can put all sorts of useful information, contact points, confidential, you know, phone lines, LifeWorks we use here in Canada as an example, that are there as almost passive available resources for the employees. And I will say, when employees really get to sort of an extreme end in terms of mental health crisis or personal crisis, they do tend to reach out for those needs. But I think the question here is really, how do you do it in a preventative way and while maintaining confidentiality? So I think the first thing is we run webinars and learning sessions. And I think the great thing about that is you can use tools like Slido or other things where people can ask anonymous questions and get responses from experts that you have. We just ran one for our director, senior director levels. We had a VP host it, but we had a mental health expert on the line. And it was really helpful for these leaders who obviously appreciate that this is happening, maybe dealing with it themselves or on their teams, but they can ask the questions in an anonymous way and get a really good sort of thorough answer from the professional. So I think that's one way. What we're really trying to figure out is the worry that we have is people also get very busy and they don't have time to reach out for this stuff. And I would say that's the part that we haven't cracked the nut on just yet is how do we actually help people who are extremely busy, sort of reaching the end of their rope, have maybe multiple issues, kids, caregiving, work, whatever, that are sort of at play. And if you have comments in the Q&A or what you're doing, I'd love to hear them, because I think you can offer all the support. You can have sessions that are either individual or group that preserve an anonymity, but actually getting to them in a way that's going to make a meaningful difference, given how busy they are, I think is one of the challenges that we're seeing right now. We've got a team that myself and one of my colleagues is leading, sort of trying to tackle that question over the next couple of weeks, actually.
It's an important question for sure. Elspeth, I want to bring you back into the conversation too. This question is about the question of age and change mindset. So I'm in a digital industry and the myth of age is huge. The question is, does moving to a change-oriented mindset correlate to the age of the team?
I think ageism is a huge issue and another amazing myth out there. And I would say that I have not seen a research study, any credible research study that sort of shows that correlation. And I'm sure that Alan has some insight onto this as well. You know, anyone can be ready for change. I think when we make assumptions based on age or anything else, that's a problem. So oftentimes providing the environment to actually just engage, you will be surprised. And Alan, I think you have a unique perspective given some of what you've been doing. So over to you. And there's a ton of really great questions, so we'll try and get through a few more of them.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the person that I've met that knows most and is actually the best professional change manager I've ever met is a grandmother. So I totally agree. Age does not have anything to do with it. You know, I do think what I would say is it goes back to that sense of muscle memory. People who've been doing things the same way for a long time will struggle when you ask them to do something different, if there isn't the appropriate support and enablement, training, whatever else to change the way they do things. The truth is, most of us, any age, are now in a position where change has been a constant in our lives for a long time. And so I think it really is for anyone, and age does not really come into this, about just mindset. That sense of learning, growth mindset, I think is so essential. And I don't think it has anything to do with age.
Yeah, I would just add one more thing, and that goes back to the really fascinating research on the power of habit, where, you know, developing a new habit or new muscle memory, you know, three things have to occur. There has to be a cue for it. You have to be able to build that new routine, that new muscle memory. There has to be some kind of reward, intrinsic or otherwise. And then you can actually show a new way. So, you know, probably enough said on that. Great question, though.
It's an important question, though, yeah. How about smaller organizations? I mean, you talked about many, many thousands of people and change managers and all that sort of thing, but what about small organizations that don't have the resources to focus on change management plans, or they haven't planned for Black Swan events? What do they do?
So maybe I can take that one. I mean, change is easier in smaller organizations. I think, you know, back to Ellen's comment about scenario planning and looking for Black Swan events. I mean, doing scenario planning is a great way to build that change muscle, plain and simple. So you can do these sorts of things more easily. But I think in small organizations, you know, everyone needs to be a pro. You don't have the same split between kind of pros. So, you know, the goal should be to create more pros, and you can do it using some of the things that we've discussed. So hopefully that provides a bit of insight.
Yeah, okay, we've got so many questions here. So what I'm going to invite you guys to do is whoever's not speaking gets to go through and pick maybe one question they want to answer. So Elspeth's going to go through and pick one she wants to answer. And I'm going to ask a question that Renee Flores is asking Alan about space. So this person who's an architect asks, it would be interesting to know if aside from home office, if there's been change in the actual physical facilities for RBC.
That's a great question. The short answer, yes. You know, what we're looking at is we believe that there is and will continue to be a need for an office. And so we're looking at how do we change the offices to suit the type of work we think we do in offices versus at home. Because a lot of our employees now are quite comfortable working from home. That's been a pretty significant shift we've seen. I would say that the collaboration and innovation are two things that are still pretty tricky to do virtually. And I think moving office spaces to have more collaborative space, more meeting space, more innovation-oriented rooms, you know, lots of whiteboards, lots of ways to sort of do brainstorming. I think that will start to take over more of the footprint And we actually have a team working on sort of workplace flexibility plan that includes real estate, HR, technology, and we're trying to come up with a unified vision for what will the worker be doing, like what will the individual employee be doing, what will their day look like, and then how do we leverage different locations inclusive of the office to create the right spaces for them to be most productive.
Wonderful, thank you. So Elspeth has gone through and she's picking out a question. Alan, you go through and pick out one question, and I suspect that's going to be time. So Elspeth, over to you.
I picked out a question for Alan. How's that for No, I think it was a great question about the value of training, and it must be worth the price. And I think Alan at RBC, you sort of described the quotes investment made.
Yeah.
But it sure does seem that 85,000 people, 3 weeks, like it's got to be working.
So we're going to have a whole other webinar on this because I love this question. My view is learning as a discipline is getting to the point where measurement of impact and value is within grasp, and we've actually started to do it in the field with our client advisors. But what I will say is, in general, teaching sort of more the human skills, ones that are really important for adapting to change, resilience, collaboration, communication, they are actually harder to measure in terms of direct business impact. But I do think that what you see is the pace again, and so you can start to look at the pace of the organization and the pace at which it responds to change, and you see that increase as you train and build these practices into your organization. And that's something that in a large company like RBC can actually be quite easy to see, because you'll see different groups on different sort of levels of proficiency on these dimensions, and they perform differently. And so I think that's one thing. What I think we need to do better at RBC, and we're continue to work on it, is data. One of the things that hampered us, I would say, in the early days, we didn't have good data on, where are our employees, how are they doing, where are they at, what are they able to connect? And so a lot of that was manual capture by our managers and then sort of filtering into a central point for collection. That data nowadays needs to be at your fingertips and so easy to access. And it's also what you're going to use to help you evaluate the value of training and building these practices.
Right.
Okay, I'm not that bad. I have one more that I'll answer, and it's a great question too. The question is: it's unfortunate but true that leaders in times of crisis will default to what they're most comfortable doing, back to training all the time. During this health crisis, that could spell danger. So, what steps can be taken around the boardroom table now to make change an ongoing strategy and not one that happens every now and again? What I would say, and part of this research project, and what I'm hearing loud and clear, is that there is a groundswell of support below the boardroom table to not slip back. And I would leverage that to the hilt. I think one of the powerful things about asking questions about lessons learned is back to Alan's comment about data. Now you start to have data around what people really want, what they've enjoyed, what the opportunities are. Let's face it, a leader will do what they will do, but armed with data, it becomes harder and harder to kind of ignore it.
Okay.
And Meredith, I think we're just about out of time.
2 minutes. Alan, do you need to say a final inspiring thing to our audience? Elspeth, the final inspiring thing about change? Anything you want to with?
If I would just say, the one thing I learned through COVID is don't underestimate the capacity of your team, your employees, for change. We got so much out of our teams through this, and more than we could ever have hoped for. Just the engagement, the passion, the work ethic. Don't underestimate your teams. They want this, and that's the truth.
Amazing, thank you. Elspeth, do you want to give us a final thought, or are you?
I would just agree 100%. I think one of the worst things that has happened over the years in the change game is we actually don't recognize what people are really capable of and what they really want to do. So I think this is a moment in time to stop treating all of this as a once every now and again activity and really getting serious about, equipping our employees with the wherewithal to not be amateurs, but to be pros.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. I need to do my little promo for online learning at Smith School of Business. So I'm going to save my farewells just to say to our audience that we've got a bunch of programs through Queen's Executive Education right now that could be interesting and maybe just right for you if you're working from home and you want to do some online learning. Coming up next week, they are offering an online program on strategic planning and leading change, which Elspeth Murray, one of today's presenters, will be teaching on. And also coming up is a program on corporate innovation, which next week's presenter, Barry Cross, will be teaching. So for more information, visit smithqueens.com/execed. And as I said, next week, I lied, 2 weeks from now, October 29th, will be our next webinar, and our guest will be Barry Cross. So stay tuned for information about that webinar. You'll be getting it in your email if you signed up with us. So I think that's it. Elspeth and Alan, thank you so much for your fantastic insights. I'm sorry, audience, we have so many amazing questions here and we can't get to them, but thank you so much for your engagement. Thank you so much, Elspeth and Alan, for your time today, and I wish everybody a very pleasant afternoon. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Alan, and be well, everyone.